ChatGPT said, the courtroom was unusually full that morning. People whispered in low tones, shifting in their seats as they waited for the judge to enter. It was one of those cases that had caught the attention of not just the families involved, but also curious townsfolk and reporters who wanted a headline. At the center of it all sat a young blind black girl, her small frame tucked in the corner beside her mother. Though she could not see the eyes that glanced her way, she could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her. Every shuffle, every cough, and every nervous sigh reached her ears with sharp clarity. She wasn't there as a main witness. At least, that's what everyone thought. She was just the younger sister of the man who stood trial, accused of something serious enough to cost him his freedom. Her brother, Marcus, had always been her rock, the one who guided her hand across crosswalks, read books aloud when her fingers grew tired of Braille, and whispered encouragement when the world seemed too harsh. Seeing, or rather, sensing him stand accused in that courtroom was something she never imagined. The judge entered with the usual authority, his footsteps steady against the wooden floor. The shuffle of robes, the bang of the gavel, and the sudden silence that followed all told her it was time. She sat straighter, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as if holding herself together. Across the room, Marcus stood beside his lawyer, his shoulders heavy, his face unseen to her but deeply familiar in spirit. She could hear the tremble in his breath, the kind he always had when life seemed to be slipping beyond his control. The prosecutor shuffled papers, his voice firm as he summarized why Marcus should face the maximum sentence. Words like evidence, responsibility, and justice rang across the courtroom, but to the girl, they sounded more like walls being built, brick by brick, to box her brother in. The defense attorney, tired from weeks of fighting, gave his final plea, but it lacked the strength to pierce the air. The judge sighed, his voice steady as he prepared to read the verdict. Everyone leaned in. The sound of pens scratching paper from reporters filled the air. It was in that moment, just as the first words of judgment were about to fall, that the girl felt something rise inside her. A mix of courage, desperation, and clarity pushed her to her feet. Her chair scraped against the floor. Heads turned. Her mother gasped softly, reaching to hold her back, but the girl's voice broke through the silence before anyone could stop her. "Don't read the sentence yet," she called out. The room froze. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. The judge blinked in surprise, his hand pausing midair. Lawyers stared at her as though a child had just interrupted the most sacred moment of law. Reporters looked up, pens suspended. Even Marcus turned his head toward her, his body tensing with both shock and fear. She took a breath, her heart pounding. Though she could not see the faces staring at her, she felt their weight pressing in, waiting, doubting. Still, her voice was steady. "Please, Your Honor," she continued, "there's something you need to hear before you make your decision. Something no one else has said." The judge narrowed his eyes, tapping the gavel lightly against the desk. He was not accustomed to being interrupted, especially not by a child. But something about her voice, its raw honesty, its trembling strength, made him hold back his reprimand. Instead, he tilted his head, studying her. "And what is it that you believe we have all missed?" he asked slowly. The girl swallowed hard, her small fingers gripping the edge of the wooden bench beside her. Her mother tried to pull her down gently, whispering for her to stop, but she shook her head firmly. "I may not see like the rest of you," she said, "but I hear. I listen. And that night, I heard something that proves my brother isn't guilty." A ripple moved through the courtroom. Some scoffed, others leaned closer. The defense attorney's eyes widened with sudden hope, while the prosecutor's lips pressed into a thin, irritated line. The judge leaned forward, folding his hands. "This is highly unusual," he said, "but I will allow her to continue. Speak, child." The girl's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected the judge to listen, but now that he had, there was no turning back. She thought of her brother, of the nights he sat with her when she cried over her blindness, telling her she had other gifts that mattered. And now, maybe those gifts were all they had left. The silence stretched as the entire courtroom waited. Every detail of the moment, the creak of a chair, the distant hum of a light, the faint smell of paper and ink etched itself into her memory. She steadied her heart and began to tell her story, not knowing how deeply her words would shake the walls of that courtroom before the day was done. The entire courtroom was frozen in silence as the young blind girl's words hung in the air. Nobody expected her to speak, let alone interrupt a judge who was just about to give the sentence. Her brother Marcus stood completely still, torn between pride and fear. He wanted to believe his little sister had the courage to help, but he also worried that the judge might scold her and brush off her voice. The judge leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingers pressed together, and for a long moment he simply studied the girl. The quiet in the room was so sharp that even the ticking of the large clock on the wall felt like a drumbeat. Reporters lowered their pens, lawyers froze in mid-motion, and the audience leaned forward, waiting to hear what could possibly be so important. She took a shaky breath, clutching the bench beside her. Her mother whispered for her to sit down, but the girl shook her head. Her voice trembled at first, but there was no mistaking the strength beneath it. That night, when everything happened, she began, I was in my room, and I heard things that nobody else seems to be talking about. I couldn't see, but I was listening. I know what I heard. The defense lawyer's eyes widened with sudden hope, while the prosecutor frowned deeply, clearly annoyed at the interruption. The judge raised a hand, signaling everyone to stay quiet. Go on, he said gently. Tell us what you believe we need to know. She nodded slowly, taking another deep breath. I heard 2 sets of footsteps. At first, I thought it was Marcus coming home. But then I realized, his footsteps are always heavier, slower. That night, one of the footsteps was light, quick, like someone nervous. The other was not Marcus. I know it. A murmur rose among the crowd. The prosecutor stood and objected, saying that this was just the imagination of a child. But the girl quickly added, her voice rising with certainty, I may not see, but I know my brother. I know the sound of his shoes, the way he walks. And the voice I heard outside wasn't his. It was someone else's. Higher, sharper. I remember it clearly. The judge motioned for silence again, clearly interested. Are you saying you heard someone else at the scene of the crime? He asked. Yes, Your Honor, she said firmly. Marcus was there after, but he wasn't the one who did it. He was calling out, trying to stop it. I heard him shout, but his voice wasn't angry, it was scared. Marcus's head dropped, his shoulders shaking, because he remembered that exact moment. He had tried to stop a fight that night, but by the time he stepped in, it was too late. He had never told his sister every detail, but somehow she had pieced it together just from what she heard. The defense lawyer quickly stood, requesting that the court take her statement into account. The prosecutor rolled his eyes, insisting that the girl's blindness made her unreliable. But the crowd seemed moved, and even the jury exchanged uneasy looks. The girl continued, her small hands gripping the wooden railing as if holding on for strength. You all think because I can't see, I don't know what's real. But I live my whole life listening, really listening when others don't. That night, I heard enough to know Marcus didn't do what you're blaming him for. The judge studied her with thoughtful eyes, the weight of her words settling over the room. He could sense the sincerity, the courage it took to speak up in front of so many strangers. He tapped his gavel lightly, not to silence her, but to give himself a moment to think. The silence was broken only by the scribbling of reporters, who now leaned forward eagerly. Everyone knew this case had taken a dramatic turn. The judge finally spoke. This court has heard many testimonies, but rarely one spoken with such honesty. This child's voice will not be dismissed. The court will allow further questioning and review before I give my verdict. The prosecutor sat down reluctantly, his jaw tight, while the defense looked almost relieved enough to cry. Marcus turned toward his sister, his lips parting in disbelief. For the first time in weeks, there was a flicker of hope in his eyes. The girl slowly lowered herself back into her seat, her hands trembling, but her heart steady. She had spoken. She had been heard. And now, for the first time, the heavy walls of that courtroom felt like they were beginning to shift. The judge's words gave the young blind girl a chance that no one expected. Her voice had interrupted the moment of finality, and now the entire courtroom leaned in, eager to know what else she could reveal. The air was heavy, but also charged with curiosity. Everyone wondered, could this child truly change the course of such a serious case? The girl sat straighter, sensing that the judge was listening closely. She could not see the expressions around her, but she felt the silence pressing in, urging her forward. She clasped her hands tightly, grounding herself in the familiar texture of her mother's sleeve beside her. "Your Honor," she said softly at first, then stronger as her courage grew, "I heard more than just footsteps that night. I heard voices. One of them was my brother's, and one was not." The prosecutor immediately stood, objecting that the testimony of a blind child could not be considered reliable. But the judge silenced him with a firm wave of his hand. "Let her continue," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The girl nodded gratefully. "I know my brother's voice. He has a deep tone, slow and steady." But the other voice was sharper, almost rushed, like someone trying to cover up fear. "They argued outside our home. I couldn't see them, but I knew they were close because I could hear the way their shoes scraped against the pavement." Marcus kept saying, "Stop, don't do this," and his voice cracked. He wasn't the one doing wrong. He was trying to stop it. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Marcus's lawyer leaned closer to him, whispering urgently, while Marcus lowered his head, overwhelmed that his little sister remembered so much. He had always tried to shield her from the pain of what happened, but here she was, bravely uncovering the truth. The girl went on, her voice steady now. The second voice said something too. I remember because it echoed in my head all night. It said, "You'll take the blame, not me." Those were the words. Clear as day. I may be blind, but I will never forget those words. The jury stirred uneasily, looking at one another. Reporters scribbled frantically. The prosecutor adjusted his tie, his face tight with frustration. The defense lawyer stood quickly and asked the judge to allow this testimony into record. The judge tapped his gavel lightly. "It will be entered," he said. Then he turned back to the girl. "Do you remember anything else?" She tilted her head, her face thoughtful. "Yes. When it was all over, I heard my brother crying. Not yelling. Not running. Crying. He came inside and held my hand so tight that night. I didn't know what had happened outside, but I knew he was scared. And I knew he was not guilty." Her mother squeezed her shoulder, tears running silently down her face. The courtroom was thick with emotion. Even those who had doubted Marcus were starting to wonder if they had judged too soon. The prosecutor tried again, insisting that the girl was too young and too emotional to be credible. But the defense countered immediately, saying her unique perspective was exactly why the truth was surfacing. "She doesn't see distractions," the lawyer argued. "She hears what others ignore. That is her strength." The judge sat in deep thought, his fingers drumming lightly on the bench. The girl's words had introduced a new layer to the case, one that could not be ignored. He looked at Marcus, then back at the girl. "This court cannot overlook such testimony," he declared. "We will re-examine the evidence in light of what has been said." Relief washed over Marcus, though his fate was still uncertain. His little sister had opened a door that had nearly been shut forever. She had reminded everyone that truth does not always come from the most obvious place. Sometimes it comes from the voice most people overlook. As she sat down, trembling but proud, the entire courtroom buzzed with whispers. What seemed like a closed case now stood wide open, because of a girl who could not see, but who listened better than anyone else. And though the verdict was not yet given, hope began to rise where despair once lived. The courtroom no longer felt like the same place it had been when the session began. Earlier, it had been filled with certainty. Most people believed Marcus would be sentenced and the case would close. But now, after the blind girl's brave words, everything was unsettled. The judge had paused the verdict. The jury looked uneasy. The prosecutor seemed restless, and the defense lawyer suddenly had a spark of hope. The girl sat back down beside her mother, her hands trembling but her heart strong. She had said what needed to be said, but she knew this wasn't over. She could sense the tension in every shuffle of feet, in every whisper among the crowd. For Marcus, this was still a fight for his freedom. The defense attorney stood and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, this new testimony proves that there are unanswered questions in this case. We ask that the court recall certain witnesses so that we may compare their words with what this young girl has revealed." The judge nodded gravely. "Very well. This court will allow further questioning." Murmurs swept across the audience. Reporters scribbled notes furiously, knowing the story had just taken an extraordinary turn. The first witness called back was a neighbor who had claimed to see Marcus near the scene. He repeated what he had said before, that he thought he saw Marcus's figure under the street light. But when the defense asked if he had heard voices or footsteps, the neighbor hesitated. I remember hearing someone," he admitted, "but I didn't pay much attention. I thought it was just Marcus." "Did you hear two sets of footsteps?" the defense pressed. The neighbor frowned, trying to recall. "Maybe, yes, now that you mention it. There might have been more than one person." The jury shifted uncomfortably. The prosecutor quickly tried to move past this, but the defense was relentless. Piece by piece, the blind girl's account was aligning with overlooked details. Then, the defense requested something bold, to have Marcus himself speak about that night. Marcus stood slowly, his voice heavy but honest. "I was there," he said quietly. "I came outside because I heard shouting. When I got there, someone was already running away. I tried to stop them, but it was too late. I didn't do what I'm accused of. I was only trying to help." The judge listened closely. The girl's earlier words about her brother crying that night echoed in everyone's mind. Marcus's honesty matched her description perfectly. Finally, the defense asked if the court could review audio evidence taken from a nearby security camera. Though the video was unclear, the faint sounds of voices and footsteps could be heard. When the recording played, the blind girl tilted her head, her face tightening with recognition. "That's it," she whispered. "That's the voice I heard. The one that said Marcus would take the blame." The courtroom erupted. The words were faint but audible enough that others began to believe her. The prosecutor looked shaken, his arguments slipping from his grasp. The judge banged his gavel to restore order. His eyes swept over the courtroom, landing briefly on the young girl who had changed everything. He leaned back in his chair, deep in thought. The tension reached its peak. It was no longer about whether Marcus had been at the scene, it was about whether he had been wrongly accused while the real culprit walked free. The judge's expression softened, though he gave nothing away yet. The girl sat silently, her small hands folded in her lap. She had done all she could, but the weight of the moment still pressed on her chest. Around her, strangers whispered words of admiration and disbelief. Her mother held her hand tightly, whispering, "You've done so well, my child." The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the judge's next words. The confrontation had shifted the entire direction of the case. Marcus was no longer seen only as the accused, he was seen as a man who might have been wrongly blamed. And everyone knew, the final decision was now hanging by a thread. ChatGPT said, the courtroom was so quiet that every breath seemed louder than it should be. After hours of questioning, after the blind girl's brave testimony and the review of the faint audio evidence, everyone knew the case could no longer be looked at the same way. The judge sat deep in thought, his hand resting on the gavel, while the jury members exchanged uneasy glances. The truth had begun to shine through the cracks, and now the only thing left was to face it fully. Marcus stood still, his hands clasped in front of him, as though holding himself together. He had been prepared to hear the worst that day, but his sister's courage had turned despair into hope. His lawyer leaned close, whispering encouragement, but Marcus's eyes never left the judge. Finally, the judge cleared his throat. His voice was calm but carried a weight that silenced every whisper. This case has brought forward many testimonies and much evidence. But what has become clear today is that there are serious doubts about the guilt of the accused. Doubts that this court cannot ignore. A ripple of emotion swept through the courtroom. The blind girl sat upright, her hands clutching her mother's tightly. She couldn't see the judge, but she could hear every pause, every shift in tone, and she knew something important was coming. The judge continued, "The testimony we heard today was unexpected, but it was honest. This child may not see with her eyes, but she has shown this court a different kind of vision, one rooted in careful listening and truth." He paused, then looked toward Marcus. "And it has made this court question what we thought we knew." The prosecutor stood, trying one last time to argue. "Your Honor, we cannot base a verdict on the words of a child alone." The judge raised his hand firmly. "This is not her words alone. This is her testimony, supported by overlooked evidence and inconsistencies in the accounts we've heard. This is about fairness. About justice." The prosecutor sank back into his seat, defeated. The defense lawyer exhaled in relief. Then, with steady authority, the judge announced, "Marcus, this court does not find you guilty of the charges. You are free to go." The gavel struck. For a moment, silence hung heavy again, as if the room itself needed time to process what had just happened. Then the sound of gasps, tears, and even a few claps filled the courtroom. Marcus closed his eyes, his knees nearly buckling from the weight that had just lifted off his shoulders. His mother wept openly, covering her face with her hands. And the blind girl, small, trembling, but brave, smiled through her tears. She didn't need to see the room to know what had happened. She felt it in the air. Marcus turned quickly and found his sister, kneeling beside her and pulling her into his arms. "You saved me," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You saved my life." She held him tightly, her face pressed against his chest. "I just told the truth," she said softly. "That's all." The judge watched the scene with thoughtful eyes, his stern expression softened. "Let this be a reminder," he said to the courtroom, "that justice is not about rushing to judgment, but about listening sometimes to the quietest voices in the room." Reporters rushed out, eager to publish the story of the blind girl who changed a verdict with nothing more than her memory and her courage. Spectators left with tears in their eyes, carrying the lesson that sometimes the most overlooked person has the clearest truth. As the family walked out together, Marcus held his sister's hand firmly, guiding her as he always had. But now, he felt that in many ways, she was the one who had guided him. The world outside still bustled with noise and judgment, but inside his heart, he carried a peace he hadn't known in months. The young girl, though blind, had shown everyone something greater than sight, the power of courage, love, and truth. And in doing so, she had reminded an entire courtroom that justice is not just written in laws, it lives in the hearts of those brave enough to speak when it matters most.